Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. If I could please ask you to take your seats, and if you want to have a chat, you're very welcome to do that outside. My name is Constanze Stetzenmüller. I'm the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be asked to moderate this very, very interesting panel. But before I do so, I thought I would take the liberty of making a brief personal remark that is nevertheless pertinent to this conference. Some of you will remember that some years ago, we met here at the margins of this conference to commemorate a great friend of Estonia, of the Baltics, a great fighter for the Transatlantic Alliance and the West, Ronald Asmus, after his death. And I want to remind you that this is the first meeting of the Lennart Meri conference after the death of our great friend Silke Timpe, who was the editor of Internationale Politik, the journal of the German Council on Foreign Relations, who died last year, October 5th, in a freak accident in a hurricane in Berlin, the only person to die in that event. And she was also a great friend of this conference and its organizers, of Estonia, of the Baltics, and we miss her greatly. She's one of a number of people who've passed in the last few months. Anne-Marie Le Glouanec of France, Pierre Rasner now. And I think it's important to remember these friends because they, I think, had an influence on the way we thought, on the way we lived, on the way we discussed with each other. And they're a reminder that the time given to us to make a difference is sometimes briefer than we think. And so with that, I'm going to lead over to this panel, which I think is here to discuss a really important question. And that is of the gaps in security and threat perceptions between the East and the South in Europe and within the Transatlantic Alliance. These gaps, as we know only too well from political discussions all across Europe and between America and Europe, have deepened in the past months and weeks and may deepen even further. So it's a privilege here to have 4 truly distinguished speakers and experts with me on the panel, and I'm going to do it like Nathalie Noguered yesterday and ask you to clap briefly in acknowledgement of my introductions. First, I have on my right the Defense Minister of Portugal, José Alberto de Azevedo Lopes, which is the only time I'm going to even attempt to pronounce this correctly. I'm going to address you as Minister forthwith. Please welcome the Minister. Then on my left, I have Jüri Luik, the Defense Minister of Estonia, whom you all know very well. Welcome. Then on my right again, Colonel Dave Pendall, the Deputy Chief of Staff of US Army in Europe and the G2. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Claudia Major, one of the best-known German defense and security experts. Truly a pleasure to have you here again. She works at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. Dr. Claudia Major. Thank you. Now, I am not going to bore you with any remarks of my own on this topic. I do promise, however, to be an intransigent moderator in every other way. And I will hand over immediately to the Portuguese Defense Minister on our right to tell us whether there really is a difference between the South and the East in threat perceptions in Europe. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to you all. And let me begin by saying the pleasure and the honor of being here in this conference. And I suppose that I've been invited to represent the South. I can imagine that this was one of the reasons. But I may begin by saying that the first problem that we have and that we have now in NATO, for instance, is to define what is the East and what is the South. Because I noticed that every member has its own perception of the South. Some of the members consider that Afghanistan is the South. Other members speak of the Gulf of Guinea. And so there is the first problem to define what geography and what is the role of geography in defining the purposes of our security and defense. You know all that NATO has some kind, somehow I would call it some kind of cliché, the 360 degrees approach. So this is our ideal to work as a global, in a global capacity to assure our security and our defense. But nevertheless, I suppose that we all agree that today geography is more important than in the past. But I also insist that in 2014, just before the Wales summit, no one knew really, no one knew what we were going to discuss in Wales. There was no topic. Everything was more or less calm, and you know what happened just before in Ukraine. And this was the renewal of a new approach of security and defense. And my problem with this eastern flank and southern flank is that if I believe in the renewal of geopolitics, for instance, we were speaking about this a few minutes ago, I also believe that no one can consider that an organization and a system like the one of NATO and even like the one that we are constructing in the European Union should be focused only in one dimension. No organization in the past has survived to a 90 degrees approach. No organization like NATO, and we Portuguese know what we are speaking when we speak about NATO because we are there since 1949. And we owe a lot to NATO. And we consider that this must be a major reflection in the organization. No one questions that NATO should be now concentrated or more concentrated in the eastern flank for one only reason, because the major issues about our security and defense are now concentrated in what we can call generally the eastern flank. But the truth is that NATO was not very efficient in working with new threats. It was not very efficient in working with Daesh, for instance. It was not very efficient in working with transnational threats that everyone in the South, if I can express myself like this, perceived as very important to our security and to the security of our citizens. And when I began in office in November 2015, the eastern flank topic was almost exclusive in NATO. We have made a lot since then. So I'm very positive on the evolution. I think that now we can speak more freely about what concerns us on security and defense. But I must insist that, for instance, the terrorist threat, Daesh, the new perception of an organization working as a military power in Syria and in Iraq, but working as a very difficult to define and transnational terrorist organization in Paris, in Berlin, in Istanbul, everywhere, in Belgium. So we began understanding that everything was maybe connected. I'm not implying that the eastern flank is more or less like the southern flank, but I must remind that Russia, because we are speaking of Russia mostly, is a threat, a direct threat to the Baltics, but it's also a direct threat in Syria. And Portugal is engaged in the MINUSCA in Central African Republic. And the Russians are there already training the armed forces of this country. And so it's somehow difficult for me to define our perceptions of threat. Today that we are speaking of new threats, non-predictable threats. And it's a mistake, I think, to concentrate exclusively in one perception of threat. I think that NATO has made, I understand that it was difficult in 2015, 2016 to speak about any other thing. But we began speaking more openly since Warsaw, for instance. Portugal and the southern countries insisted a lot that in the conclusions there should be something to give a sense to the organization. But Portugal has already shown, I suppose, no one can doubt, on our solidarity. We are fully engaged in the eastern flank. We are engaged in Afghanistan. When you discuss on NATO perspective, the three Cs, cash, capabilities, and contributions, we have always insisted it was important to understand what we mean by contributions. I could speak very positively about Portugal, of course. But I can also speak positively about Estonia, because I must insist that Estonia is, of course, very directly concerned about the eastern flank, but Estonia is engaged, for instance, in Mali. So it's a little country, but it shows much more than other countries that its perspective and its solidarity goes and works in a much more broader approach than only the eastern flank. So what I think, and I think that I'm approaching my, or even going, my 5 minutes, I think that it will be understood, I suppose, very soon that we need very clearly a new strategic concept for NATO. We don't have a contemporary strategic concept. I think that we understood in the European Union with our new global strategy the importance that it had to accelerate the reflection on what we should do together in the European Union with NATO. But I think that we need this now in NATO, because we are always speaking about a 360-degree approach, but no one knows really what we are speaking about.
Minister, thank you very much. If I might follow up there, all the diplomats that I've ever talked to who've been part of the writing of a strategic concept for NATO have intimated very clearly that they'd much rather be waterboarded than go through the experience again. So
that's why I'm not ambassador.
So explain to us, why exactly do we need a new strategic concept? And perhaps you might mention in that, or explain to us in that context as well, how you overcome the visible reluctance of some NATO member states to have NATO in the lead with regard to southern threats and challenges. There is a clear difference in preferences within NATO. It's very obvious that NATO is the lead organization with regard to the eastern flank. It is much less obvious in the south because of the very mixed opinions of NATO states on this. So how do you see NATO's role there, and why do we need a new strategic concept?
It's the problem of difficulty and what is more easy to do. The eastern flank approach is a very traditional way of looking to NATO. NATO was constructed in a very classical perspective, within a very classical opponent. It was a group of states that were united to create an alliance against another state and group of states. And so the way of thinking, and the way of thinking even from the military perspective, it's much more easy when you think about the eastern flank than if you want to think a much more complicated approach like Daesh, like Al-Qaeda, and so on. And that's why my interpretation is that it's more comfortable to look in a classical way, how many battalions, how many brigades, what is the classical effort in a very territorial perspective that you need to face this. I'm not diminishing the threat. I'm not saying it's too classical, but the truth is that no one wants now, apparently, very strong missions in the south, to say it very clearly. We have to create a coalition to go under the leadership of the United States to go to Iraq and to Syria. Even the Sea Guardian mission is somehow, I didn't say a very cozy mission, but a very similar mission to other missions that we already have in the European Union. So what I'm afraid of, and I'm not very afraid of, but what is a concern for me is the idea that NATO will be more and more limited in its purpose. And we are now seeing international relations, and this is important that we think also politically in this evolution. I think that the defense relations of Portugal was much more easy 10 years ago. Because now, and this can be a concern for us, if you lose unity in our international approach on security and defense. So now more and more, and that's why Portugal is insisting that it's important to look to the east, to the south, much more today even than this dichotomy to the Atlantic and to the southern part of the Atlantic because of new threats coming from the north. Sure. And so you have more and more one organization concerned with the eastern flank, and then you have some kind of different geometries for certain purposes. Now we are looking to the European Union. If you look to Africa, you are looking mostly to United Nations or to atypical groups like the G5 Sahel. And so these different geometries can be more efficient. But there is also the risk of losing a global perspective and losing coherence. This what Portugal is afraid of, and that's why we were insisting in a southern approach. We always said that it was impossible to make in the south or to propose to the south the same thing that we are looking when we are discussing the eastern flank.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm going to turn now to Jüri Luik. Jüri, the Baltic are in the somewhat depressing position of having been right all along about the threats from the east.
Finally.
I assume this gives you little satisfaction, since the challenge from Russia is ongoing, since, as your president very movingly said last night, the challenges from war in Ukraine and the Russian presence in Georgia are ongoing. Is this, are we on the right track with NATO's role in the eastern flank? Are we doing enough? Are we missing out on things?
Well, thank you very much. And, I mean, it is indeed true that the events have proven us right on almost all accounts when we have described the Russian threat. But it is also obvious that this is no source of great happiness to us. And in fact, we are extremely happy and grateful that the Allies have constructed this logical and strong deterrence to protect the Baltic states, to deter any possible military action against us. Now, I could go into this deterrence issue in detail, but I won't do that.
Thank you.
Yes, I won't do that. I would like to make a couple of remarks about the gaps. I think the east, sort of south gap is to some extent a theoretical construct. In some ways it sounds logical. I mean, one is very far from the other. And there are indeed very different threats. On the other hand, I think NATO is quite well adapted to deal with both issues because you need very different assets. I mean, in the east, you are talking about land forces, you are talking about very conventional capabilities. In the south, you are talking more about the rapid reaction forces, special operation forces, training, partnership. So these assets you need are very different. That's why I don't think there are any practical reasons to describe it as a gap. And politically, I mean, what were the main ingredients of that gap theory? One was, of course, the opinion regarding Russia. I think it has fundamentally changed now. And as my Portuguese colleague very well pointed out, Russia is extremely active in the south. And the the biggest war or military conflict where Russia is involved is closest to our NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, very far from the Baltic shores. And Russia has been very active in the whole southern perimeter of the alliance, including with intrusions, cyber attacks, trying to interfere to elections and referendums, etc., etc. So in some ways, Russia has done a lot to maintain or strengthen the unity of the alliance. The other understanding is that these East Europeans, they have been so submerged to their own concerns that they don't have any particular awareness of what is happening in the South. That they don't sort of understand it to be sympathetic enough. And I think that is also a stereotype, and it's clearly not true. If you look at the Estonian military operations where we participate nowadays, none of these operations goes higher than Slovenia. None of them. So basically, you are talking about 9 operations in 6 countries, all in the south. So I would say there is already a body of knowledge here in Estonia about the concerns of the south, and of course this also indicates our readiness to participate in solving or at least mitigating the crisis in the south, as well as, and I yesterday expressed great appreciation to Portugal of southern countries like Portugal being very actively involved in the deterrence here in the Baltic states, being now a lead country in air policing as we speak from Lithuania, and also sending special troops, rapid reaction troops to exercises, etc., etc. So everybody is doing our bit. Basically, the gaps are elsewhere. I mean, there's no secret that while in NATO everybody is equal and everybody has one share, some of the shares are kind of golden. And it's, of course, the United States, France, UK, Germany, the big ones who keep the core.
Thank you for saying that Germany is one of the big ones.
I mean,
Much appreciated.
I could have even started from that, but I didn't.
That's all right.
So basically,
you know, we do have a sense of realism remaining. Come on.
So basically, the most concerning gap is, of course, the gap between the bigs. I mean, that is the gap which can seriously shatter the alliance. And unfortunately, we see now that especially the latest approach where political leaders are quite visibly putting their country first and sort of retreating from the international order which is based on international organizations. Well, there are many countries like that. I won't name any names. I mean, it's
all right. Don't worry. I wasn't trying to trap you.
This is a real challenge, and I think the weakness of NATO is manifested by this weakening understanding of unity and of values. But not only. I mean, NATO itself has done stuff which has enforced that approach. For instance, the slowness of decision-making. I mean, there is a crisis, you have to do something about it, you come to the NATO Council and you submerge to these endless discussions about the minutiae of a possible operation should something be decided ever. Mm-hmm. And of course, countries, especially big powers, don't have time for that. And so the decisions to use the coalitions of the willing are increasing. I mean, we saw it in Syria. The operation was done quickly, effectively, and without any contribution or any discussion about it in NATO. And to be honest, we are doing the same thing. Occasionally, we don't have either time to discuss, or we don't have a feeling that NATO is far enough to help us. For instance, cyber defense. I mean, as you know, Estonia is a big cyber country, and our main relationships are really with some of the key powers who developed their own cyber defenses in a very impressive manner, like the United States, France, several other countries. So we do the same in a way, and it is unfortunate, and it is very important that NATO would be able more quickly and flexibly respond to the real concerns of the allies. Otherwise, it's really sort of losing its ground. Finally, on strategic concept, I was in NATO 2010 as ambassador, and I actually negotiated the old concept. I would agree with you. It would be a horrible exercise, and there are several reasons for that. One is purely conceptual. I mean, the present concept, for those who have read it, is absolutely up to date because it was written to give flexibility to the alliance. So all the bases are actually covered there. If we would start negotiating today, there would be very important frictions, which would be very difficult to negotiate. For instance, famous 2%. I mean, it's evident that there are countries who would want 2% to be enshrined in the strategic concept. There are other countries who are probably equally ready to
not have it enshrined.
Not have it enshrined, yes. And this is only one issue. I mean, there are other serious friction points. So, in fact, the idea of negotiating a new concept would be if we could manage to create more unity. But if we use this exercise simply to outline our frictions and problems, then I think that wouldn't be the right thing to do. And finally, you know, NATO ambassadors always have a lot of clout in their capitals. But the problem is that in many capitals, and I'm not talking about Estonia, the political class or the political leadership has moved away from NATO issues. There is not very much expertise, and to imagine that if a NATO ambassador negotiates strategic concept, that it would somehow move upstairs and sort of increase readiness in the highest corridors of powers to understand NATO issues, I don't think that's true. If the ambassadors are given the mandate, they will negotiate it. It will be a solid piece of paper, well negotiated, but I'm not sure that it would have a strong political impact to the cohesion of the alliance.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I thought that was, you made some incredibly useful and important points, particularly in reminding us that the gaps of perception are not limited to the gap between the East and the South, and that in fact we now have divergences within the alliances that in many ways are much more dramatic and much more potentially damaging than that, and by reminding us that security elites, to which I suppose we all belong, are now on the defensive within their own political establishments and domestically, and that their bandwidth has been significantly reduced. Of course, the irony here is that one of the things that has reduced this bandwidth is the pressure created by things like the migrant crisis on domestic politics, the increase in populism. So that is where the circle closes. Let me move on to Colonel Pendle to tell us a little bit about the military aspects of managing these different threat perceptions. Thank you, and thanks for being with us, Dave.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be part of this panel and an important discourse on a very important topic. I'm going to start out the mission of the United States Army in Europe, which is the land component. It is the Army service component of the U.S. European Command. We as Army Europe are not part of the NATO command structure, but we see ourselves as a key enabler and supporter of NATO and enjoy supporting the important training, experimentation, and interoperability goals of NATO as we serve across Europe. Our first priority is readiness, ensuring that our soldiers have the tools and training to be lethal and be ready to fight and win. We provide Army capability to the U.S. European Command, as I mentioned, and work to set the theater clearly with the essential legal, political, and practical support of our allies and partners across Europe. Training with our allies and partners here in Europe provides unique opportunities to hone our skills. Without ready forces and relevant capabilities, the military reinforcement of political decisions and direction for action is unachievable by definition. As we look so-called strategic direction east with an emphasis on deterrence and a capability to defend when necessary with the full will of NATO, we also have strategic direction south, which emphasizes projecting stability to mitigate threats, those acute threats to Europe and the transnational threats NATO alliance nations are facing. And that continues, mitigating conflict-driven migration from the Middle East and Africa, as well as looking at ways to address the spread of extremist ideology across the same geographies, but also manifesting inside the European nations as individuals are drawn to that ideology or inspired to act from it, or the infiltration of cells and networked actors from returning foreign fighters coming back home. They all remain threats to the nations as a terrorist threat. SACEUR has a commitment toward horizon scanning, and that facilitates situational awareness, drawing on the contributions and information sharing from the allies and partners as they see those threats and risks. SACEUR has said increased awareness will also enhance and increase the speed of decision making, and that's political and military, and for adjusting our force postures and taking further deterrence action and responses across the alliance, across multiple domains. And this is a wicked problem to manage, and it will never be solvable. And it's primarily political, as it is a major part of the equation to manage the problem is each nation's ability to generate capacity and capability to address these threats that they assess to their homeland and their own national interests, as well as offering parts of that capability for the security and defense of the alliance. Every nation as a sovereign entity has a right, and some argue an obligation, to maintain the capacity and capability to defend itself and its interests as a viable sovereign. Every nation also has the right to join other nations in alliance and security constructs that offer value of enhanced national security. And that's the major point here. Today's globalized world, coupled with the democratization of information and advanced technologies, no single nation can deal fully or alone with the threats, risks, and the adversaries that they face, which goes back to the conditions that create that wicked problem. Collective defense and allied action, along with the unity and commitment of NATO as a whole, is the design, and that design is adapting. Clearly, this is a guns or butter discussion or question, and there is a piece of that is NATO burden sharing and burden sharing to the commitment. The amount of guns, broadly the force levels and capacity of any single nation, and what that nation invests and sustains as a ready, relevant, and capable force is part of the political dialogue internal to each nation, but also a commitment to the alliance. And there is a security benefit that is exponential to the cost of those forces contributed. And so really, the question is, well, how much does a regional or global war really cost? And what's each nation's commitment to defense in the alliance? With that guns or butter initial question, the question here seems to be, okay, we have a force contributed to NATO, and we're part of the fabric of NATO's 29 nations. How NATO allocates those forces and postures itself is either enhancing one strategic direction over another region and a perceived burden or risk to the other. And in my view, that's a political question, but somewhat of a false dilemma. As you see NATO continue to focus on collective defense and interoperability, you have increased information sharing, interoperability, experimentation, and interoperability in both technical and operational means, enhanced dialogue, and really a crystallization of the threats, which were described very well by both defense ministers here. And the risks under this framework are identified. And this informs the political dialogue in the NAC, but also allows a better strategy and operational planning and adaptation within SHAPE and the military posturing. And those postures are either for acute threats or a long-term and demonstrably growing threat coming from the East. Whatever the political decisions are or the allocations of those decisions to employ forces under NATO across these operational frameworks, across all warfighting domains, land, sea, airspace, and increasingly cyberspace, we do have that 360-degree geographic framework. And it requires those forces to be ready, relevant, and capable of executing their assigned tasks. And without ready forces and a collective will to employ them, there is no military capability. To deal with that threat, to provide stability, to mitigate malign influence, or to deter aggression, or defend in a crisis when necessary. Russia remains a primary security concern, if not military threat, but as Carl Bildt characterized it last evening on the panel, perhaps best, a long-term adversary to the Eastern and Northern European nations' sovereignty and interests, but as also discussed, they're increasingly operating in the South. At the same time, persistent conflict and insecurity across parts of African continent and Middle East are animating much of the internal security discourse across many European nations and drive the very real domestic security decisions for military force employment and out-of-sector or external deployment of the very same military and security services that would otherwise be available to NATO. What I'm speaking here is those deployments under the EU, the African Union, or UN operations, as well as the resubordination of military defense assets to the military of interior to support domestic security, protect infrastructure and public spaces, and combat terrorism internally. And these are all the same pool of forces. So some of those force types are clearly optimized for one direction over another. In the end, a smart defense program under NATO, it still requires whatever force is made available to be ready, and a thoughtful and politically viable approach must be made to gain and sustain new or additional capabilities under a coherent burden-sharing program. And with all this, as we talk about defense, there is a need to view these frameworks and the actions and commitments within those frameworks as only part of a national or an allied collective defense strategy. It is a very major part, of course, and while absolutely necessary, it still remains insufficient. The defense component is insufficient in that the full scope of security as a national and international security requires coherent domestic, civil, private, public, and international integration, cooperation, and commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. Let me ask you something, and I won't, since your remit is a military one, I won't ask you a political question, but I would like to pick up with you a point just made by Yuri Luke. And it's the increasing degree to which NATO member states are finding NATO decision-making processes and presumably also force generation processes so cumbersome that they turn more and more to coalitions of the willing as the framework of choice for operations, and particularly in the South. Is that a boon? Is that a good development, or is that a bad development? Does that make you, does that put wheels under you, or does it, do you think that risks undermining the cohesion of the alliance?
I think a tailored response by a coalition of the willing actually offers more flexibility. What it does, though, is dilute the pool of resources to NATO, as I mentioned. I think the big questions of NATO commitment obviously take key political decision in the NAC, but what NATO also does is provide that initial foundation for interoperability, understanding each other, understanding the ability to integrate forces, and whether those forces end up being committed under NATO or some other framework, I think it still provides that fabric to work from. We have a great exercise program in Europe, in both the north, in the east and in the south. I think the things we learn from multinational exercises that are not necessarily NATO exercises have continued to grow capacity and understanding across the alliance.
All right, thank you very much. Claudia, I'm going to turn to you last to perhaps open the frame of this discussion a little more into politics. The things we've heard so far, it seems to me, suggest that NATO is at its most efficient and coherent where it does things that it has known how to do for a very long time. And in some ways, I would even go so far as to suggest, and I mean this very deliberately as a provocation, that our traditional frameworks for making decisions, generating forces, are strongest in the East, and in some ways they help us paper over political disagreements. In other words, our military institutions and processes are propping us up. Whereas the farther south we go, the less strong this prop is, the less strong this corset is, and the more our deepening political disagreements show. Would you agree with this assessment? And if so, is there anything that we can do about it?
That's the easy question now for the end of the panel. First of all, thank you. And I just thought that normally I like to spend my Saturday mornings in a different way. But hearing that kind of question, it gives me a good, it just shows it was good to change the program, which I normally have on Saturday mornings. I actually tend to think that we talk a lot about those east, south, the question you just raised, because we don't like to talk about the questions that are particularly painful. And these are the questions in the alliance about solidarity, unity, and cohesion. So we're talking about East, the Russians, or the South, and this Russia now, and the South. That's all very valid. We forgot about the High North. We didn't talk about space. But I think eventually the key question is, are we still a political alliance, united to be able to act? And I would like to concentrate a little bit on those points, and I want to make three very brief points. And the first is what I would call the very fragile basis of the alliance. The second is what I call the transatlantic challenge, and the third one, and we hinted upon that already, is ever and ever again the German question. So let's start with the kind of challenge solidarity or the fragile basis. We are roughly ahead 6 weeks of the NATO summit in Brussels. And this summit could actually be a very pleasant summit because it's implementation, it's not like Wales, we're changing courses. So it's all pre-prepared, there's some thorny issues, but overall it could be a nice one. And at the same time, we are all deeply worried about that summit going totally wrong. And it could be disruptive, it could be unpleasant, we simply don't know. So I tend to think that the biggest challenge for that summit, and that also for NATO ahead, is to demonstrate solidarity in the face of growing internal tensions. Are we able to keep the house together at that summit and even beyond? So I tend to think the success is not really to be measured in the decisions we are going to take or that are going to be taken at this summit. The success is going to be if it's a smooth summit without any major incident. So it's about managing Trump, Twitter, and 29 allies. That's rather challenging. So it's important to avoid any divisive statements, any questioning of commitments, any too major naming and shaming, and it would be really, really nice and fancy to have a strong statement of allied solidarity and unity. The problem is that this cohesion and solidarity is really internally under pressure because we have increasingly tensions between allies, and they're carrying their bilateral problems into the alliance. Just some examples. Turkish-American relations are at a low point due to the Turkish interventions in Syria. Many allies criticize actually the reorientation of Turkey, especially its rather pro-Russian approach. The decision or the inflections to buy Russian equipment is not really helpful here. Some allies import their political domestic issues, like minority issues, into NATO, and are blocking cooperation, like the NATO-Ukraine Commission. Then we have some ideas to negotiate bilateral agreements, like the Warsaw proposal that was also already mentioned yesterday evening, which I tend to think are understandable in the short-term dimension, because there might be the quick fix that has just been mentioned. But in a long-term perspective, they are a major headache for alliance solidarity. So I think that's just some examples to show that the internal cohesion, solidarity is a bit shaky. But I tend to think, and that's my second point, the biggest challenge remains the transatlantic one. Relations have never been easy, but I have the impression that Europeans and Americans are now increasingly adopting positions in central foreign security questions which are almost contradictory. Just some examples. The US withdrew from the Iran agreement, where many Europeans think this is one of the best things they have ever done in diplomacy. The majority of the Europeans are criticizing that the US is relocating or has relocated its embassy to Jerusalem. The decision taken 2 days ago to impose tariffs on European goods irritates the European Union, to put it very mildly. And there are more, Paris Agreement and other things. And these, I tend to think, are not only different positions or different decisions, they actually point to very different worldviews and potentially very long-term differences. Most of the things, you might say, correctly, don't really affect NATO's core business. But I don't think you can avoid a spillover in terms of atmosphere and in terms of cohesion and believing in the same thing into NATO. It's particularly Trump who is actually unsettling European allies, because he's making contradictory statements about US contributions to NATO, and because they seem to put them in a kind of transactional logic. You pay, you get security. And this is irritating because many people tend to think that security commitments should be unconditional. The interesting bit is that you have on the one side the rhetorics, which tend to be quite a catastrophe, and on the other hand you have the boots on the ground, so the facts on the ground, which haven't changed. The American commitment to Europe has even increased in terms of money, in terms of troops, many things. So what do? You have the deeds and you have the words. And I tend to think if you don't frame the deeds with words, they lose their power. And the gap between what is said and what is happening on the ground is insecurity, is doubt about what the US is actually standing for. And I don't need to say that in that conference, that insecurity in defense is very unpleasant. And the kind of side effect is that the impression to the outside world is that the alliance can be divided. Over the course of history, NATO solidarity, cohesion has never been all sunshine and roses. It has always been difficult. But I think it's a different quality what we are witnessing in the moment. So I tend to think one of the biggest challenges we have had in NATO is actually to demonstrate solidarity internally and externally, and to prevent those internal tensions to weaken the alliance even more. Let me finish with my country, or to put it differently, the German question. For Germany, and taking again the example of the summit, this will be a very challenging summit. Not only because Germany considers NATO being the central organization for defense, but also because Germany can be ready to get very harsh naming and shaming, particularly from the US and possibly other allies too. Mainly because the German defense budget is at 1.2 at the moment. And we can probably debate whether 2% is a smart goal, but it's around. I think that even a figure below 2% for Germany would be acceptable if we would see a clear, substantial increase of the defense budget over time, over the next year. But according to the budget plans which are currently debated, not yet decided, but seriously debated, the budget will rise up to 1.3 in 2021, and then it might just stagnate or go down again. So that first means that Germany is pretty likely to not meet the Wales Defence Investment Pledge, which we knew before. But I think it will also, if you break it down to military tasks, it also means that Germany is unlikely to fulfill what it promised itself in its own white book and what the German parliament asked the German armed forces to do. So it means that the modernization or just making all the material the German armed forces has work will probably not happen. Germany is unlikely to maintain all its NATO commitment and is probably unlikely to maintain European cooperation plans, like, for example, the German-Norwegian submarine fleet. So the first is not living up to NATO promises. The second is probably not even living up to its own promises, what the Bundeswehr should do. Maybe it's asked too much, but it would be nice if all the material the German armed forces have would actually work. But I think the biggest danger that I personally see is the lack or is the loss of credibility as a reliable partner. Germany is one, and the minister just said it, one of the maybe not so small countries in NATO. So they have a certain responsibility. Many of the smaller and medium-sized countries decided to cooperate very closely with Germany in the Framework Nation Consent and in other contexts. So they organized their armed forces, planning, personnel, equipment together with Germany. If Germany now says, I'm really sorry, but not sure this is going to work in the future, this not only affects Germany, this affects Europe, and it affects the European capacity to act. So it's, if I might put it in that way, it's beyond Germany. It's about Europe. And independently of how the reaction to the US will develop, Germany will remain one of the key actors in European defense. So it's about long-term thinking and about long-term solidarity in Europe. And that's the kind of circle to my initial statement. In the end, it boils down to solidarity in the alliance that allows us, in the second step, to act in the south, in the north, in space, and in the east. But it boils down to political solidarity and unity.
Thank you very much. I wish I didn't agree with you as much as I do. I will, however, amplify one of the things that you've said and that Yuri hinted at, which is based on my own observations, having lived in Washington now for the last 3.5 years, which is, it seems to me that it is hard to overstate the amount, despite all the praiseworthy things that the Pentagon has done in particular, for the reinforcement of forces, of NATO forces in Eastern Europe. It is hard to overstate the degree to which within the alliance there is now disagreement about fundamentals. And let me put it very simply. I think in my more than 20 years of observing, analyzing, writing about this relationship, I have never seen as deep a rift. I was there for the Yugoslav wars and Kosovo. I was there for Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And all these disputes that we had were about means. They were about when to use force, to what degree, and in what groupings politically, and with what arguments. We are now disagreeing about the ends. We are disagreeing about the shape of the international order. We are disagreeing about the value of globalization and the value of norms as the basis for our behavior. That strikes me as the most profound wedge in the transatlantic relationship that I have ever seen, and our adversaries are noticing this and they're acting accordingly. With that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions and comments. Please introduce yourselves, and I'm going to give the first word, of course, to Sven Zakov.
Thank you, Sven Zakov, ICDS. A comment and two short questions. And the comment really stems from what, Constance, you ended up with. And I think one big worry what we should all have, all Atlanticists should have, is the potential coming wave of anti-Americanism in Europe, which really derives from really a personality of one person. But, of course, the manifestation can have a profound effect on the US-Europe relations, which, right now, as has been pointed out in a way that it's like what Mark Twain said about the music of Beethoven, it's better than it sounds when it comes to the US participation in security in Europe. If you reinvent Twitter, it's all right, it's very good. But, of course, you cannot reinvent Twitter. Now, the two questions. One is for the Minister of Portugal. Could you briefly describe actually what needs to be done? Because I have heard throughout the years that South is important, but what exactly needs to be done? We know exactly what the East wants. Basically presence and so forth, EGATF, but what's the really practical steps? And the second question is to our Germans in a panel. Could you explain, if you could, your government's position on NATO-Russia Founding Act, and why is this thing still a thing? I just, read through. It's based on 7 principles, very nice principles, democracy and so forth. Russia has broken every one of those principles, which this one is standing on. And so basically, why is that still a thing?
All right, thank you very much. Let me hand over to you, Minister, first.
Thank you. It's a very difficult question, the one that you are asking me to answer, but the first thing that I wanted to say is that I thought that I was quite pessimistic in beginning my intervention, but I noticed that there is much more pessimism around me, and I'm not so negative even about NATO. I think that NATO has some potential. We believe strongly in Portugal that NATO is a part of our genetic code on security and defense, and that's why we think that it's important to stress what we consider that can be bad strategies and bad decisions. And when I insisted that NATO was turning to be a very classical organization, this reminds me the old couples, old marriages, in which parts parts of the couple or both are trying to find some excitement outside marriage. And that's somehow the fate that I'm afraid of seeing in NATO. We decide that NATO is a very classical organization. We replicate the model that we know since the 40s, and we close the door. And we decide that it is efficient like this. My perspective is that NATO is less efficient if it turns to be only a classical approach to security and defense. And NATO is very classical today, and NATO is very traditional today, and NATO has very few land missions, as you know. It's somehow surprising to see that such an organization with such a global ambition has 2 missions. One of those missions, Afghanistan, the other, Kosovo. And I don't need to say how I consider that the mission in Kosovo is slowly turning to be more symbolic presence than any other thing. And so this is the major issue, and that's why I'm very fortunate to disagree with my dear friend, colleague from Estonia, because when you say that it's difficult today to define a new strategic concept, it's very easy to say it's very difficult to define a strategic concept. But the problem is that we are building the house, I don't know from where, from the roof or from the underground, because we are defining a new strategic command, a new structure of command, without a very clear reflection on what we need the organization to. When General Scaparotti, I like very much General Scaparotti. I think he's a brilliant SACEUR, and he made somehow some kind of an European tour explaining the new structure command. So he visited Lisbon, and they showed me the new structure of command. And it's somehow ridiculous, but I only tried to find where is the south here. Oh, there is the hub and more. Minister, there is no more, it's the hub. So, I don't think it's satisfying. So I was obliged to think and to react in a very stupid way, looking only where was what I consider to be important to redefine the organization. And when you ask me, what should we do to the South? The first thing is, I think that we cannot do the same thing that we are doing in the East. So it's not to compare quantities. It's not to compare brigades. It's not to compare capabilities or capacities involved in those somehow artificial perspectives of insecurity. But we don't work on DCB measures. We are still incapable of defining in a tailor-made approach what we consider should be important to help our friends in the South. We don't have a clear reflection on very strategic and difficult insecurity issues, the Maghreb, the Sahel. We don't have any perspective on this.
If I might,
Excuse me.
I mean, you're making a very clear diagnosis of what all the problems are, but we still have the problem that there is no consensus within NATO on NATO actually doing those things. In
Yes,
that
that's
case, is there a plan B? In other words, is it an option to put the EU in the lead with its new defense cooperation ideas, or is it alternatively an option to use the French approach and to say we'll have a Europe-only coalition of the willing, and then we put NATO into a supporting position? Which is de facto
as a politician,
where
I
we
have
seem
some
to be right
limits
now.
in what I can say publicly, as you can understand. Because,
Well, you can try and
and I'm
push
already
towards those
speaking
limits.
to the limits, but when you look to NATO and you see a very strong ally in the eastern flank, Turkey, but a very strange ally in the southern flank, Turkey. When you see that you avoid speaking about the Turkish issue, but it's very strange to see a country with such strange relations in the southern part of our security concerns. When you see what you are invoking now, the growing of an European defense perspective that was unexpected 3 years ago. When you see the Brexit, when you see the frictions around the 2%, which this mythical approach of our duties on cash capabilities and contributions, you understand many things. You understand that now, if you want to consider what is the more dynamic reality, I would not hesitate saying that it's European Union.
Okay.
That you find more new things, more new defensive approaches. But the problem is, as my other colleague from the panel said, the problem is that what you see in the European Union, what you see with permanent cooperation, what you see with this European initiative on intervention, these are all reactions. These are not spontaneous initiatives to create something new. These are very preoccupying reactions about something that we consider, even if we say that everything is peace and love, if we consider that we have some issues on NATO, and the next summit,
I think that's a very valid point.
I hope
Yeah.
it will not demonstrate this pessimistic approach.
Okay. Claudia, do you want to take on the NATO-Russia Council question and the German policy?
I mean,
Life is unfair, I know.
I don't speak for the German government, so I can just try to explain. I think there's a general agreement that the NATO-Russia Founding Act has been broken, violated by Russia. But I think there's also the idea to say if NATO would officially cancel it, or if NATO would say that's not longer valid, we withdraw from it, that could give Russia the opportunity to finger point then NATO and the West and say, hey, you're breaking the rule, you withdraw from it, and that could be used as a pretext for further escalation. So I think there's a general consciousness that the basis of the Founding Act is not longer there, but it's a different question to say we publicly, openly walk out of it. Don't know whether you want to add.
Let me just add something to that. I essentially agree with Claudia. I think I understand the critique very much, Sven, but I think, honestly, my feelings are completely mixed on this one. I think that de facto the NATO-Russia Council is a hollow shell of what it ever was, and to the degree that it ever had any use. But for us to take the first step in abolishing it strikes me as also going a step too far. However, that German position would be less problematic if there weren't things like Nord Stream 2. A project which I ideally wish would just, go away. Then on the other hand, we've been the ones holding together the Russia sanctions consensus, and paying a fairly large price for that in terms of German economic costs. I think that on the whole, this government's position on Russia has been, apart from the Nord Stream 2 project, where I think they've just been not courageous, has been a good one, and shouldn't lead its allies in Europe and in NATO to doubt that the Germans are on the wrong side of Russia. I think you will all have noticed the new Foreign Minister Heiko Maas's remarks on Russia. I think that generally you shouldn't worry about that, and I think we shouldn't overly focus on what is a sort of the ruined leftover of an institutional format. I think I personally think we have more serious issues to worry about, and Nord Stream 2 would be one of them. And in general, energy security, and frankly, continuing to keep Ukraine on a path of stabilization and democratic transformation by all of us. Anyway, this was too long a response. I'm conscious of the passage of time. I'm going to take 3 questions now. I have Vlad Sokor, then I have David Kramer, I have Alar Olyum, and I also have Espen Barth Eide. And I would ask you to all 4 be brief, and then we're going to ask the panel to choose. If we have time left over, we'll go into a second round. So my first one was Vlad. Over here. And if I've missed anybody, I apologize. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Vladimir Sokol, James Tower Foundation. I'd like to bring up the Black Sea region. Question to the panel. Do you perceive a gap to exist on NATO's eastern front between the Baltic, Polish area and the Black Sea region in terms of NATO deployments and NATO capabilities?
Thank you. That's a very
good question. Do you perceive this gap to exist? Yep. And if so, what to do about it?
Great. Thank you very much. That's both succinct and interesting. David.
Thank you. Quick question about a different gap. That is, we're now a little over 10 years from Bucharest when NATO declared Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Is this gap ever going to get closed?
Thank you. Alar Olyum, over there. Thanks.
Alar Olyum, I work for the European External Action Service. I sense that there's a gap in perception of Russia with regard to the East and the South. In the East, we seem to have a growing awareness of Russia as an adversary and seem to be reacting adequately, as Yuri said. But in the South, it seems that we still perceive Russia as being a constructive ally, at least in the fight against ISIS and terrorism. But if you look at the Russian involvement in Syria, I wonder if that is really true. They have succeeded in supporting and saving a vicious regime there, which has resulted in the worst catastrophe since the Second World War in terms of humanitarian costs, and a permanent presence militarily. So I wonder, my question is, do we not need now a clear global strategy towards Russia, one that recognizes that it is not our ally neither in the south nor in the east. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, I have Espen Barth Eide up here. Can we get a microphone here? Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Yep. Here.
Thank you, Constanze. So my question is building on the last one, which is, aren't we overstating the geographical dimension of East and South? Because I actually think it's more about strategic setting. Because the South, in my view, is a continuation of 20 years of focus on chaos, disorder, weak state, non-state actors, engaging in trying to sort out problems in the chaos belt, whereas East is associated with the return of strategic competition, where the adversary or the relevant other is another, internally coherent, strong state with a different purpose than ours, and that it would be easier to talk about this as asymmetry versus symmetry or something like that, rather than just think of it in geographical concepts, because as both ministers pointed out, the two meet. I mean, Syria is both. Syria, in a sense, started as South, but turned into something that has to do with East versus West as well. So I think that would be helpful if we think about it as our setting versus who we are, in a sense, defending against. Is it chaos or is it an alternative order?
Thank you, Espen. I think we were just being good panelists and trying to answer the question that the organizers asked us to answer. But with that, who wants to take a stab at the Black Sea question? Yuri? Okay.
I think we have to look at the Black Sea region, obviously, in the context of the last wars and the enormous strategic importance it has also vis-à-vis the Mediterranean. So I think it is a very relevant question whether enough has been done in the Baltic Sea and in the in the Black Sea and in the Black Sea region. Of course, we have a small thing called the Montreux Convention, and that is something which seriously limits the Allied options on the Black Sea. I think, regardless of that, we have found ways of being present there and showing the flag there, but I think much more needs to be done. Now, interestingly, Russia tries to copy this same situation on the Baltic Sea, because Russia would like the Danish Straits to be akin to something related to a Montreux Convention. That's why all ships which pass the Danish Straits and which are not regional, i.e. from the coastal countries of the Baltic Sea, are being seriously harassed by the Russian Air Force, by Russian helicopters, and by Russian ships. It's mainly the US ships, of course, but also French, British, several others. So there is a clear desire, both on the Black Sea and on the Baltics, to push the alliance out from those regions and to restore the the status of these seas as part of the Russian sphere of influence. Basically, the Baltic Sea during the Cold War, it was more with notable exceptions, of course, but it was more kind of an internal lake of the Warsaw Pact. So I think this is a matter of concern and should be followed very closely. I would also take the Ukraine and Georgia question.
All right, go for it.
Okay. On Ukraine and Georgia, I've told to my Ukrainian and Georgian friends, it's never over. It's absolutely never over. And the best example is, of course, the membership of the Baltic states in the alliance. I mean, the stars suddenly aligned, and something which was akin to a miracle suddenly happened. There were several aspects which nobody would have imagined happening, like the love affair between Putin and Bush, like 9/11, which made territorial defense irrelevant and brought the anti-terrorist fight in the forefront creating this feeling that we are all in one boat. And it really doesn't make a difference who is in what organization. And there are a number of other aspects like that. Stars were aligned, but the question was, or the point was, we were ready to take a jump as soon as there was a moment, a brief moment. After a year, the moment was not there. I mean, the tensions with the Iraq war, etc., became a serious stumbling point in East-West relationship, in transatlantic relationship. And I'm sure if the debate would have happened then, it would have been already poisoned by the Iraq issue. So wait for this moment, but if it arrives, use it as quickly as possible.
You know, I'm finding myself extrapolating from your very interesting point, which I completely take, that 9/11 gave an opportunity for us to forget geopolitics.
It doesn't sound well, but it is true.
It does suggest that we ought to wait for another 9/11 and then get in all the other ones, which I think we can't want.
I'm not making that
Which we really can't want, I know. I'm just being...
I pass on that.
But let me move to you, Minister, and ask you, I'm maybe going to slightly reframe Alar Olyum's question, which is, do we still think that the Russians are a constructive partner anywhere, including in the south?
I think that many accept this idea implicitly. I'm not saying this, and I don't agree with this perspective, but the truth is that many states very realistic approaches of international relations. Some of my colleagues, that I will not nominate, of course, tell me what is the difference between Turkey and Russia. We are yes, but the problem, you can disagree. You can disagree. But the problem is you can avoid this kind of comparisons. And what we say in private can be very surprising when you compare with the public declarations. I'm more homogeneous, so what I say in private is more or less what I say in public. But the truth is that some countries consider that Russia was very useful in Syria, much more than Turkey. And so they consider Russia more than an adversary, much more than an enemy. And the problem is no one is totally right. And I don't believe in some kind of new evil and constructing the idea of international relations with one evil. It's very comfortable for us to say this, and that's why one of our major problems since 9/11 is the black-white perspective of the world. And many times, in many conflicts, you must accept that neither participants in this conflict is acceptable. I could say Syria, but I could say many other conflicts. I could say Kosovo to some extent. We began learning that when we support A against B, we can be doing something extremely wrong. And the idea, that's why I can see that there is some traumatic approach now to, for instance, the Article 5 of NATO. We were traumatized with Iraq in 2003. So no one wants now to involve in something that we know how we begin, but we don't know how to get out. And that's why I think there is the increase of these coalitions of the willings, very, very limited actions, very dramatic actions. This last action in Syria. I felt like being in a theater. I'm not criticizing, because very clearly no one who bombed Syria wanted to kill civilians or to destroy too much. It was a clear political sign with military means. And I'm not criticizing, I'm saying I can accept this. But it's true what you said, that we no more discuss if it is lawful, if it is wrongful. We discuss now what are our targets and what are our fundamental purposes. And this is more worrying. than any other discussion. I discussed it a lot, the 2003 intervention in Iraq. I was totally against, and I am still convinced that it was a wrongful action that we committed against this country, but I don't care about this. Now, what is much more worrying is that we are discussing and we disagree on fundamentals. And this is what worries me on the international context of security, the idea that I cannot be too clear on the position about Russia, on the position about some of our fundamental allies. I'm not obsessed with Turkey. I can live very well with Turkey, but the truth is that my heart balances when you speak about certain things that we are seeing in certain parts of the world. When we are discussing for too much long the idea of having NATO in a mission in Iraq, a very soft, very cool mission, but nevertheless, we are discussing it for, Yuri, 1.5 years, 2 years. So I think this is a good demonstration that maybe it's important now to agree on some fundamentals, even if it is a minimum standard. But if we agree, we must act very quickly. Because if we don't do so, if we are too ambitious in defining priorities and ambitions, but we must wait 2.5 years to get one mission in Iraq, that it's not even an Article 5 mission. It's a mission on training, and this is difficult to explain even to our citizens, because I'm always asked when I go to the parliament, in what do you spend your money? This is a problem that it is a political problem, but it has strategical consequences.
We're basically running out of time, so I am going to cut off the list here. I'm going to ask Dave Pendle and Claudia Mayor whether they want to come in on these questions. Colonel?
The Black Sea question, we are continuing to, I think, expand what we're doing with the Black Sea. We just finished a major exercise last year between Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. The efforts to look land, sea, and air across the Black Sea region, I think, is expanding. I think we'll see a more tailored force presence that augments the enhanced forward presence that we have in the northern portion of Europe, the Balts. I think that's an important area to continue to look at because of the threats emanating out of Crimea and the amount of control that the Russian, through conventional weapon systems, have placed in position, in posture in the Black Sea region.
Thank you very much. Claudia, do you maybe want to address Espen Barth Eide's question about us not looking enough at the new challenges and focusing too much on geopolitics and geostrategy, if I understood you correctly?
Very happy to do that. A very quick comment on the Black Sea one, because we obviously have a major difference between the enhanced forward presence and the tailored forward presence in the south. And that's to a large extent due to the Montreux Convention, which is very limiting on time and on the tonnage. But it's also because the countries of the Black Sea don't agree on what they really want. If you look at what Romania wants, what Bulgaria wants, and what Turkey wants, they don't agree. There are some who want more presence of NATO and some who said, we'd rather do it on our own. And if countries don't agree, then it's very difficult to call for NATO to do more, because it's not the same strong statement that we see in the East. So that's why, that's also one of the reasons, and it actually boils down to NATO is about member states. Georgia, I can't say something about the long term. Nobody expected the Berlin Wall to come down. So long term might always bring us good surprises. But short term, I'm actually very skeptical, and particularly because of the Baltic accession to NATO. I think this now honoring the promises to defend the Baltic countries and Poland makes NATO more aware of what it really has to do in the end. And this is why I tend to think it makes it more critical about Ukraine and Georgia, because it not only means we take it on the paper, it means if you really do that, you have to live up to your promises. And I wish I could put it differently, but if an alliance that cannot agree for a long time to deliver weapons to Ukraine, so-called defensive weapons, do you expect that alliance to adopt Ukraine as a member to be defended according to Article 5? I mean, it's a very nasty statement to do, but I think, in all honesty, in the short term, I don't really see an agreement growing up to make them member. Long time, I would be happy to be proven totally wrong. Like we have, most of us has been proven totally wrong on the on the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
But short term, I think honesty is painful, but maybe more helpful.
Okay. I get the impression that the Defense Minister of Estonia would like to intervene
do a bilateral
and to
over
have
the
the last
coffee
word here.
break.
Sorry, Espen, I think your question is going to remain unanswered.
Yeah, I have never heard an argument that the Baltic membership sort of automatically kind of indicates to the leaders in Europe or in the United States that Ukraine and Georgia shouldn't be taken to NATO. In fact, it indicates the contrary. I mean, it's, I think, a good story. It shows that aggression can be deterred and military action is not necessary. And the deterrence is actually made with very small forces, while we see in Georgia and in Ukraine that if such deterrence is not developed, those countries become targets of an attack. To be honest, if the Baltic states would not be in NATO today, nobody would accept us to the alliance, and we would probably be seriously screwed. When
Don't finish on that unhappy note.
when considering the situation as it stands today in the world.
Well, if I might then, as the moderator, interject myself into this one very briefly. It seems to me, though, that the Baltic states are different from Ukraine and Georgia in one really important way. And that is that they demonstrated at the time to all of us an amount of national cohesion, a sense of national purpose, a willingness to do whatever was necessary in terms of their internal transformation that astounded and humbled us all, and I think made it clear for us that we had a moral obligation to take in countries that were willing to do this. And let me remind you all that this happened again when the Baltic countries, at the height of the global financial crisis, decided to adopt the euro for political reasons at immense cost to themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that, in any way, that future entrant countries should be seen as the sole holders of obligations to transform according to our expectations before we are willing to let them in. But what my point is rather another one, is that we should help them transform in our own interests, because that expands our own sphere of security, so that at the end of this transformation process, the question of membership in both NATO and the EU answers itself, because there is only one obvious answer. That would be my response to your question. And now I'm really going to shut up, because otherwise the coalition of the willing in this room is going to dribble away because we're eating into your coffee break. Please help me thank our speakers. Thank you very much for letting me moderate.